Hello everyone, and welcome to Anti-Forensics Reverse Engineering, a leading phone forensic tool. My name is Matt Bergen, and I'm a Red Team member and vulnerability researcher for CoreLogic Security. I've released just over 50 security advisories in the last 10 years, and today I would like to talk to you about 3 of them. So, we have a bit of ground to cover, but we'll quickly review what we'll be talking about. I'll give you an idea of what initially caught my attention, how I went about getting targets to play with, what I had to do in order to set up a debugging environment, my reverse engineering process, things I found after breaking their encryption algorithm, concerns that I have, and a way you might be able to protect your data. So what is a Cellebrite? Well, pretty much what you see is what you get. It's a tool designed to help break into mobile phones and enable the user to recover information from it. It can unlock encrypted devices, remove lock screens, read application data, etc. This information can then be imported into analysis software that they also develop. It's an honorable goal, right? They want to help law enforcement solve criminal cases and bring justice to victims. Forensic evidence undoubtedly helps do this. More information for investigators means leads in cases are established easier, and relevant information can be uncovered more quickly. I'm sure these tools have helped make the job of law enforcement investigators much easier. Normally, companies like Cellebrite don't want their tools to be leaked either, with reasons ranging from not wanting to help quote-unquote the bad guys or protecting trade secrets. When you Google tools like these, though, you often see both sides of the coin. Groups like the Human Rights Watch, Privacy International, EFF, the ACLU, as well as many others who agree that in some way, shape, or form, law enforcement hacking can be harmful, and not just in the United States. There was a court petition recently filed in Israel for their Foreign Defense Ministry to no longer allow Cellebrite to be sold to Hong Kong. I'm not sure what happened to this. This was in August of 2020, but not too long after that, Cellebrite announced that it would no longer sell to customers in Russia after an Israeli newspaper discussed Cellebrite's tools being used to hack political opposition. Gizmodo also released a story about a K-12 school district in the United States who is relying on these tools for investigations into student-teacher relationships. Also in the US, I went through some of our public information websites. I found groups like the Secret Service spending $500,000 on tools from Cellebrite. The city of Beverly Hills spent $50,000 on tools from Cellebrite, and the Department of Homeland Security spent somewhere between $30 and $35 million on tools from Cellebrite. You'll see the cost for a used and/or new version of these tools in just a moment. And with that number in mind, the budget of $35 million is pretty mind-boggling. Checking out Google Trends, it is not just the United States that these tools are being used, it's pretty much everywhere. So others have talked about these tools before. I'm by no means the first. The source code for Cellebrite had been leaked at one point. Encryption mechanisms that we'll talk about later on had been broken. Cellebrite had been hacked into and lost almost a terabyte of data. Someone even ran Doom on one of the Cellebrite UFEDs, which is kind of cool. I didn't know if I would be wasting my time here or not, but I was definitely curious about what was going on. So how do you get a hold of these, though, right? Well, it turns out there are 2 models, a consumer model and a government model, one that's more commonly used by law enforcement. And you can acquire either model through eBay, and they range in costs between $100 and $2,500. If you look kind of mid-center screen, you'll see this one particular one has a valid license through 2025. It costs $2,000 USD, and presumably you can still get updates for this device. So you can also get the UFED just as a software, a normal thick application install for a laptop. I think you might also need a special hub to go with it, but I'm not sure. On the left side of the screen, you'll see the makes and models that I've just taken some sample screenshots of what these tools can go after. And on the right-hand side, you'll see the version and settings. The top right one is from the physical UFED device, and the bottom right one is from the UFED for PC software. So I keep up with their release notes in case anything particularly interesting pops up. And to give you an idea of what their latest tools support, UFED for PC has around 31,000 different extraction profiles. It supports almost 11,000 applications and can read data from applications ranging from things like text messaging apps to your social media apps to travel, and of course your dating applications like Tinder and Grindr. So some of the exploits used by these tools, I don't know, I can't say when they became public. I can't say if Cellebrite first discovered one or more of these vulnerabilities and prior to being discovered in the public, or if they were first publicly documented and then later implemented in their tools. I believe at least in the case of Checkmate, it was implemented later on, but that was mostly based off of media coverage. The content I had access to at the time was a couple years old. There weren't any recent or unreleased privilege escalation exploits in the archive that I found, but there was still some interesting content worth reviewing. If for some reason your UFED device can't compromise a target, you can send it off to them, and their services team will run some exploits that they keep behind the scenes. Third-party forensic firms often have services teams with other capabilities that aren't otherwise offered through their product line. In the case of Cellebrite, at least, what you do is you send in the device that you want to be compromised, and they'll send it back to you in an unlocked form. This is what their services team capabilities look like currently, and you can always find the up-to-date information on their website, but it doesn't change too often. So I had some devices, and I needed to get system privilege so that I could set up my debugging environment. They try to lock you into a pretty jailed environment. You're not able to access things like the task manager. The start menu has a lot of reduced items in it. You can't access the file system directly. And all of this is done through local policy. So what I did was, you still have to be able to connect these things to the internet to receive updates, etc. One of the features that is left available is the Windows Networking Manager. So I used the Windows Networking Manager to open up a file dialog using a certificate-based authentication for wireless. And once I had a file dialog there, very similar to a Citrus Escape, if anybody is familiar with those, I simply traversed to the system32 directory where I could hit cmd.exe. Then I copied over a Meterpreter payload where I could then run it and have it connect back to a C2, which I controlled. Then I set up a local forward from my C2 to the target Cellebrite device for the port 445 so that I could deliver Eternal Blue and escalate to system privilege. From here, I simply added myself a local administrator user that I could log into, and I was able to continue from there. So the UFED software does have some anti-debugging features compiled in. You can see on the right-hand side the Themita error message that you receive when you launch the application and the debugger is also running. Those familiar with Themita know it can be a pretty tough battle. I didn't do anything original in this case. I had just read what was implemented by others before me and used that. Through a combination of plugins, I was able to bypass the debugger detection. Mid-screen, you'll see a cheap Motorola phone attached to the Cellebrite console powered by a SMD rework station with some duct tape to hold the power connectors in. The debugger is OllyDebug. It's sitting at a breakpoint on the SHA-256 function from Common DLL. And I've used OllyScript to help dump the file unpacking DLLs, rebuild the import address tables, as well as other plugins like StrongOD and Phantom to help hide the debugger process. So I'm not the first person to break EPR. It was first broken in 2017 by somebody associated with a hack against Cellebrite. I didn't realize the EPR had already been broken until after I had finished breaking the first version myself. The experience breaking it myself, though, was pretty invaluable, as version 2 was similar but slightly more difficult. It's slowly progressed over the years, but they're at a point now where the architecture they have chosen has given them very limited options on what additional measures they can take in the future. So I don't suspect this will be unbreakable anytime soon. But within these archives, they're just zip files once you decrypt them, and they have some of their hacker goodies in there. So a little bit of background. These are AES 256 CBC encrypted archives. Each vendor has their own archive. Things that apply generically are stored together. The decryption process happens in memory. It doesn't rely on a standard library. And I tried 2 different approaches, only one of which I had real success with. I tried hooking directly into their libraries and making calls to the relevant functions. And it started to work, but I wasn't making enough ground. So I moved to simply attaching to the process with the debugger and observing what was going on in assembly and memory, and then recreating that same process outside. With the first version, a SHA-256 hash of a string is immediately identifiable. It's hard-coded inside of the decryption DLL. There's a header that you can also discard, basically byte 22. Everything after that is the actual encrypted ciphertext, and everything before that is a header. You can kind of ignore everything before that. Byte 22 goes away in the next version. For version 2, we start with an encrypted header and use an AES key and IV that is hard-coded in the unpacking DLL to decrypt it. The first envelope is open now. Josh Harden, a colleague of mine, helped reverse some of the second envelope. For this one, we have we XOR 2 D words together, which produces the ending D word of a SHA-256. I use this D word to find the SHA-256 hash from within the unpacking DLL, and the next IV is taken from the file header. The second envelope is open now, and the third envelope can then be opened where the final key material resides. Using this key material, everything after byte 128 can be decrypted in blocks of 65,536, producing a valid zip file at the end. So version 3 is the same as version 2 for the most part, with the bytes used to derive subsequent keys having been updated. I believe their approach going forward will be to rotate these bytes with each new release. This would require someone to reverse engineer the correct byte map each release or develop an automated method to do so. Here's a screenshot of the decryptor that I've written and released. You'll notice the key material is not shown and has not been publicly released. My goal is not to give everyone blanket access to these resources, but to provide proof that these problems do exist and we should be talking about them more openly. I think the content of these archives is just as important, though, and we'll talk about that also. So what do you get? One of the things you get is a post-exploitation toolkit called KnockoutNG. This is heavily relied on. This tool facilitates different types of device access for the user. For example, you can use KnockoutNG to build an image that will load ADB with no authentication requirements. You can use it to run automated reading of the device's file system, or you can use it to remove authentication or run attacks against encrypted partitions. For example, on the right, we have a function from the binary brute force. This function has a generic call to the kmtz run command function nested in a while loop, which iterates over a password dictionary. An interesting limitation in this function is that when it reads the next password to be tested on line 104, this limits the length of that password to 32 characters. What about when the device is up and running? APKs like Mr. MeeSeeks help automate the process of evidence collection by running binaries or performing tasks. And like a good MeeSeeks, it'll disappear when it's done. In our case, Mr. MeeSeeks starts an action.delete intent on itself. Mr. MeeSeeks is a reference to the Rick and Morty TV show episode where Jerry has to improve his golf game, and he has a Mr. MeeSeeks box that you pop, and out comes a Mr. MeeSeeks to give him some extra help. Perhaps even more interesting is Alohomora. Alohomora is a reference to a magical spell in the Harry Potter series, which is used to unlock locks. It seems like a fitting name given the feature is designed to remove the lock screen from affected devices. Publicly facing, this feature is called Lockpick. I don't know much about it. It's probably the least investigated portion of my research and is likely to be one of the future projects down the road. One of the biggest issues I found relates to ADB. Some of the available extractions will rely on the Android debug bridge. Forensic tools will often use ADB to sideload their tools or download information from the target device. At least when I was working on this research, the Cellebrite devices instructed the user to permanently accept the RSA keys on the devices being extracted. That may or may not still be the case, I'm not sure. I found the private keys used for their ADB authentication within were hard-coded within DLLs. Here on the right-hand side, you can see the location to where these keys are and their cross-references to them. Maybe I was wrong, though. Dead code or something, right? I thought a quick and easy test would be to plug in some Android phones to my Cellebrite devices. I had 5 or 6 at this point and a lot of 40 or so Motorola devices, and see what fingerprint they gave when connecting. I'm sure you can guess what happened. They all shared the same fingerprint. So what does that mean? Well, every Cellebrite, regardless of owner, country, government, whatever you want to say, they all used the same keys. A total of 3 keys were found hard-coded in the ADB client, and a 4th key was found alongside the KnockoutNG tool. You could get a copy of the private keys by hooking the right functions or just copying the bytes straight from the ADB client's DLL. With the UFED UI instructing users to permanently trust these keys, anyone with access to them could come back and later reattach to the target devices without needing the UFED at all and without any additional user prompts. A design like this makes it possible for someone to plant fake evidence on a device with plausible attribution that it was a UFED having connected and not a malicious actor doing something naughty. Now, it isn't just this easy. An actual malicious actor would need to stomp on the file metadata to place the device in the possession of the target individual, or potentially other considerations that would need to be made as well. From an operational perspective, though, the exploits you would need to make these changes are on the file system of the Cellebrite device, and you can access them. Now, I debated about not including these next slides since they're only relevant to the United States, but I kept them in the hopes that your takeaway will be a curiosity about how this may work in your own country. So with all this in mind, I started having other questions, like regarding 0 days. Should we use 0 days for law enforcement? Well, I'd be lying if I said I knew the right answer, but I've worked with enough 0 days to know that each we don't patch exposes us a little bit, and sometimes a lot. The exploits used to collect evidence from someone suspected of a murder are the same kind of exploits that are often used by a country's adversaries against them, and they could potentially even be for the same vulnerabilities. With over 50 public advisories that I have released, it takes both hands to count the number of times I've gotten an email from someone saying they knew about the vulnerability that I had just published. At least in my experience, the implied secrecy is just not nearly as effective as one might think it is, and more often than not, you're probably not the only person that knows about a particular vulnerability. So how do you balance public risk versus reward? I don't envy the people involved, but the US does have a policy and process. I think in and of itself has some flaws, but we do have one. Some of the issues I see with it, at least in my own reading, is that it only applies to vulnerabilities discovered by the US government. Presumably, when law enforcement reaches out to a third party like CAS, and they use exploits they keep behind the scenes, the use of those exploits is not subject to the same risk-reward evaluation. Further, the ones that are under this policy have Part 2A and Part 2B of Appendix B, which act as a catch-all for continued use until they're no longer effective. Some exploits have lived for a decade. That's exposed risk for everybody, regardless if you break the law or not. And finally, we have no transparency into the input and output of this policy. The executive summary is supposedly not classified, but everything else is, and I've been unable to find the unclassified summaries, and trust me, I've tried. So I reported all of these issues to Cellebrite, and although they disagreed with the risk, they produced patches for all of the issues that we brought forward. Surely things like this should have been caught before, though, right? Why should forensic examiners in other countries have access to the same key material used to image devices in another country? Before our disclosure, this was the case, going back to at least March of 2016, and in all reality, probably earlier than that. This got me wondering whether or not tools like these have to comply with any sort of minimum standards or accreditation process, and the short answer is they don't. We do have the CFTT. The CFTT is a testing program from NIST that validates that tools function as their features describe. That is, if a forensic tool is being marketed as able to extract Instagram messages from a Samsung 10 running Android 11, they'll build a test case that validates this. Nothing in their methodology, though, calls for the type of testing that we've talked about today. I would call it adversarial testing. The CFTT does seem like a great framework to extend this type of testing into, though. It produces valid findings as it is today, and extending it while also adopting legislation that requires tools like these to undergo and pass tests, including the type of adversarial tests we've talked about today, would provide the ability to regulate and enforce standards on these tools. I think that's good for everybody. I think it's good for everyone from a forensic analyst and prosecutors who rely on these tools to gather evidence, all the way to someone who has been accused of a crime. I also believe the way that any process is implemented to acquire forensic evidence should be publicly known and freely available for scrutiny. In a fair system of justice, the accused should have a right to confront their accusers, and that should extend to information about the way data are gathered for use in criminal investigations. The core issue is that every citizen should have the right to cross-examine the evidence acquired, the origin of the process used to acquire it, the acquisition process itself, how acquired data were processed or analyzed, and how any conclusions were drawn from those efforts. It's my opinion that our community should be advocating for transparency, open source solutions, and legislative policies designed to strike an appropriate balance between human rights and the needs of law enforcement, while also respecting national security. Basically, any government agency not part of the military acting in defense of the nation should be required to disclose vulnerabilities identified or used in criminal investigations using industry-recognized procedures and standards. We're at least starting to see some courts requiring disclosure relating to technologies used in criminal investigations, and I'm hopeful this is a trend we see continue. So occasionally I see questions like, can I defend against Cellebrite? And I like a challenge. So the answer is yes, but also very much no. The easiest to deploy defenses are while the Android OS is running, and I wrote an example of how that could work. Generally speaking, though, I wouldn't run anything like lockup and expect to be safe from forensics tools, as that's unlikely to be the case. Lockup specifically is a userland application and a proof of concept. It's designed to fail open, makes no attempt to hide itself, and is only meant to show that some defenses are possible, not to provide them in depth. The concept does not require root privilege, but does require the device admin privilege. It will start on boot and attempt to defend itself against some of the techniques used by the UFED, very much dependent upon the extraction type and what device you've installed it on. So how does it work? The application registers to receive broadcasts that can be used to influence what checks are performed and when. In the case of Mr. MeeSeeks, for example, a broadcast is sent when any application is installed, and that's received by lockup. Lockup will check the SHA-256 hash and other certificate characteristics of the application's certificate against known malicious applications, and if it's ever found, then a call to factory reset the device occurs. This is also true for exploits and binaries that copy onto the device as well. Lockup also lets you set a plausible deniability password through the user accessibility service. When this service is enabled, the lock screen will leak one character of your password at a time, and lockup can register to receive these keystrokes. Having an application receive your keystrokes is also a good reason not to run an application, and so it's optional and disabled by default. I'll say it one more time. Don't run lockup on your actual device. Let's check out a demo though. So here we see lockup's user interface, and it's connected to the Cellebrite. It's a rather old install of Android, and here we're at the emergency screen, and we're performing a file system-based extraction to a removable drive. The ADB client will then connect to the ADB Daemon on the target device. It'll instruct you to always accept the key. You hit OK, and now the Cellebrite is connecting to pull some information that it will use to decide what to do next. And now it's decided and is installing applications and copying things over to the device, which has been detected now, and lockup then sent a command to factory reset the device, and now the demo's over. All right, so a slightly better way. Patching AOSP seems like a better way to go, something that you simply can't easily remove. As in the case of lockup, you can just uninstall it before you begin to image your device, and then the checks no longer apply and you're good to go. So I wanted to have something that wasn't as easy to remove. So I forked Lineage OS, and I've been working on a set of patches in my spare time. But I'm by no means a seasoned Android developer. So during this talk, if any of you have had the thought, there's a way better way to do this, sweet. You're part of the reason why I submitted to this conference. These are the areas of AOSP that I've decided to patch, but I'd be really curious to hear from anyone else if you have other ideas of different methods that can be used or different locations that we can apply patches in, that kind of thing. I'm very interested to hear that, and my contact information is at the end of the slides. So with as many disclosures as I've had, I still wasn't really sure what to expect. Worst case, I'd figure they'd try to stop the disclosure, and oops, I've wound up with a FBI party van outside my house and some maybe understandably angry exploit developers at my gateway. Well, the reality wasn't quite that. The people at Cellebrite were very friendly, and they worked to address the issues in a timely way. I certainly wouldn't be afraid to disclose other issues that I come across to them again. They were a decent group of people. I also ended up getting nominated for some ponies. I got a couple CVEs issued for this, and also I was able to present for you folks here today. So all in all, I think it was a good research process, and I was quite happy with it. Some of the future work I'll probably look into includes Alohomora. That was easily the least researched part of everything that I looked into so far. I also have some ideas on how to detect and respond to the automated device detection feature that the UFED relies on. When you plug it in, the first thing that it tries to do is automatically identify what phone it's talking to, and it has a particular algorithm that it goes through when doing that. I also have equipment from a few other players in the market that I'll eventually open up, and I'm always interested to hear if you have access to them as well. Advisories are in the QR code. Thank you to everybody who helped make the research public. Cellebrite, the CoreLogic Vulnerability Disclosure Board. Real special thanks to Derek Brown and Hank, Josh Harden and Clayton Monroe. They really went out of their way to help with the disclosure process and kind of getting things pushed through. If you have any questions, you can find me on EFNet, Freenode, NetGarage, or worst case level at corelogic.com. Thank you everybody for your time.